And so to the second of the smaller parties, UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party. You'll have seen their purple posters around. Their leader is in the House of Lords, Lord Pearson. He joins me now.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming in, Lord Pearson. Let's go. We understand your policy on withdrawal from the EU, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But can I ask about some of the other policies that have come through so far in the mini-manifesto? Well, just, if I may, first of all, on the size of the cutback that you want to see in the state. You're talking about much more drastic cuts in state spending and welfare spending than the other parties.
Yes, I mean, I'm afraid the level of cuts that's being discussed by the three failed old parties simply is not realistic when you look at our financial predicament, which is a deficit of 160 billion and a debt in 2013 of 1.3 trillion. I mean, these are huge figures. And therefore, UKIP is best known, of course, for its policy of leaving the European Union. And we say that, I mean, the elephant in the room about this whole economic debate is the cost of our EU membership, which has been put by the Taxpayers' Alliance at up to £120 billion a year. And just the cash that we hand to Brussels every year, if you take the government's figures for 2008, the net cash that we sent, not the gross cash, but the net hard cash we sent to Brussels was £6.6 billion. Now,
you say
that's all very well, but no, that is £18 million a day. And £18 million pays for 600 nurses for a year. So we've got to put these squandered squillions, which I find difficult to get, into that sort of context.
Your own figures and your own party, however, say that you've got to go a lot further than simply, as it were, taking that saving. Yeah. And you're proposing about a third out of a lot of government spending plans, and above all in the welfare budget. And I wonder how you would take that kind of money out of the welfare budget. Would you simply limit the amount of time unemployment benefit could be paid for? Would you have some dramatic new way of dealing with people on disability? How would you do that?
Well, first of all, you've got to make the savings
That's right, yes.
across the board before you start looking at cutting the waste which lies behind the front line. We're not proposing to cut any frontline services, but we do say that only by looking at the colossal cost of the EU and, for instance, the Institute of Directors and the Taxpayers' Alliance, I mean, not wild Eurosceptic calculating people. They have found an extra 50 billion, which you can't call it cuts. It's simply removing waste. So you've got your
But you're going a lot further. Your party suggests much, much deeper cuts in that, and also a flat rate of tax, I think, yes. A flat 31% rate of tax for everybody.
Above 11,500 a year, yeah.
So that takes a lot of people out of tax and so on, but overall it's expensive. You want to spend more money on the armed services, and you want to spend as much money on schools and hospitals. I come back to the question, where are you going to remove the big lumps of spending to allow you to do that?
Well, by leaving the European Union,
but and by following that's not enough.
Yeah, and by following the IOD and Taxpayers' Alliance, how to save 50 billion, and then by cutting waste. There's no doubt about it that the frontline services in this country, if you take the military, apparently there, for every 2 soldiers, there's a bureaucrat in the Ministry of Defence. That can't be right. And if you look at the National Health Service, it's perfectly obvious that it's weighed down by administrative costs to the detriment of the front line.
I'm disappointed to hear you talking about you know, waste savings and reductions, because it seemed to me that your manifesto was much bolder. Mini-manifesto saying you're taking a third out of welfare.
Well, we don't want to alter the front line of welfare. And we believe that were we to have something like the flat tax system, were we to be set free from the crippling over-regulation of the European Union and everything, the economy would respond. It always has responded. Economies do respond to that sort of thing. And so we've got to get the politicians and the weight of regulation and complete I don't use the word cut. We simply want to get rid of the massive waste.
All right. What about immigration? You want a complete freeze on immigration for 5 years.
For permanent settlement.
For permanent settlement. How does that work if there's somebody in the country whose skills the country thinks it wants, or that perhaps somebody who's been in a particularly difficult refugee situation?
Well, I mean, obviously, if asylum, we're not touching. Genuine asylum, of course we support that. Britain must maintain its reputation for that, absolutely. Otherwise, why shouldn't we be like the United States of America, or Canada, Australia, New Zealand? If we want people to come in to do jobs here and to contribute to the economy, then they should come in on a visa, on a permit. Also, families, we're not thinking of axing families. We're not thinking of sending anyone away. Our freeze is on permanent settlement for 5 years.
And you make the point, obviously, you can't do that unless you leave the European Union.
No, you can't.
Right.
You can't.
Can I just ask
leaving the European Union ties straight into immigration and straight into the economy.
Can I just ask you about a story that was in one of the papers today, in The Observer, about one of the people who funds you, or has funded you in the past, this chap, Henry Angust. He's Swiss-born, and he's now putting a lot of money behind the Conservatives. I think he's... Now, you know this chap. What's he like?
Well,
not in terms of his political views.
He's Swiss, and he's a personal friend of mine, so I must declare an interest there. He runs a very successful organisation in the city, and he is Eurosceptic. There's no doubt about it. And he has funded in the past my think tank, my Global Britain think tank, most of the activity of which goes on monitoring the BBC. You'll be pleased to hear, particularly the Today programme. And I think it is the Global Britain research which forced the BBC into its first ever independent inquiry into the balance of its coverage on the European Union, and the independent inquiry found unequivocally that the BBC was very biased in favour of the BBC.
I'm now scared about being watched myself.
Yes, you are. Well, no, you're being monitored.
I'm being monitored.
You're being monitored.
Well, I'll take that. I'll be very cautious in that case.
We don't mind your programme.
But just on this guy, because he's put a lot of money into your interests and your part of the spectrum, and he's putting money into the Conservative part of the spectrum. Does that mean that he thinks, perhaps you think, that once the election's over, the Conservatives will turn out to be a great deal more Eurosceptic than they're saying in public?
Well, I think Henry is someone who would like the Conservative Party to be more Eurosceptic, and he's someone who is, I think, and there are many of my friends who are working from within the Conservative Party to achieve that. I think all of them, and most of the Conservative grassroots and us, we're very disappointed that David Cameron did not deliver the referendum on our membership of the European Union, which he promised.
Do you think it's short-term tactics, though, perhaps, rather than deep belief that in fact David Cameron and the Conservative Party are a bit more Eurosceptic than they're letting on?
Well, I fear the leadership isn't.
Right.
And that is very serious, because if Cameron were to get a working majority and be in power for 5 years, having refused a referendum on in or out of the European Union, the colossal costs attached and all the rest of it, then after 5 more years of integration into the corrupt octopus in Brussels, we will no longer just be enmeshed in its tentacles as we are now, but we'll be in its bowels. Everything will have gone. The City of London supervision, justice and home affairs and so on. I mean, it's very serious.
If you get your first MP, which, who knows, at this election, could you imagine working with the Conservatives in any way, if they win?
Well, we'll work with the right sort of Conservative, yes, I hope so. And what we want to achieve out of this election is to make it clear that none of the failed old parties can form a government unless they give us a referendum on the European Union. And more than that, the prize for us, obviously a hung parliament, would probably deliver some form of proportional representation. And we want binding referendums, national and local, on the Swiss model. On the Swiss model.
Lord Pearson, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
To find out more about who we are and what we stand for, go to the UK Independence Party website at www.ukip.org.